So today I want to put together a little video and talk about Rose for Emily. It's a pretty big story, a little bit more complicated than Story of an Hour, but it's definitely worth reading and talking about. So this was written by William Faulkner, who's typically considered, this kind of great Southern writer, and he always kind of explores a theme throughout all of his work. And that theme has to do with this idea of the decay and the decadence, the decline of post-Civil War South. And so what this means is, well, we typically call that Reconstruction. What that means is he deals with the new dynamics of the South post-Civil War. The whole South is turned upside down. Now, I'm no historian, so I'm just going to kind of broad stroke this. The economy's gone, power's gone. There's no the kind of aristocratic kind of lifestyle of a lot of people have gone. Slavery's gone. African Americans are free. So everything is quite different than it was prior to the Civil War. One of the things that's kind of important to remember is this idea of this sort of Reconstruction South is placed against this idea of the antebellum South or pre-Civil War South. Even today, we kind of highly romanticize and idealize this antebellum era. It's kind of that Gone with the Wind kind of idea, the aristocratic plantation owner, those kind of ideas, and those ideas aren't really gone yet. For example, I'm just going to give you one example. So I'm not from the South, I'm from the Pacific Northwest. When you drive around some of these southern cities, and you see it a lot in Bluffton, you see it a lot in Hilton Head, in this area, that these housing developments that they build, they'll tag a name plantation on them, X plantation. I can't even remember the names, but they're all over the place. But for me, when I see plantation, it really has sort of negative connotations. I can't imagine why anybody would call a place a plantation, nevertheless live there. Because what I associate with plantations is basically a nightmare. Slaves being raped, murdered, their children sold off, their spouses sold off, beaten, the brutality of it all. So I don't think for me, it's a very pretty picture, I mean, I do kind of understand the way that we romanticize and idealize the past, and we always do. But in this case, those kind of notions of the past are still kind of alive and well, even in the 21st century, and we're quite a ways from the Civil War. So this overview, you can read this. I'm going to go ahead and post a text version of this and assignments and the video version in this. So we're going to talk about a lot of the ideas here, and this is just kind of an overview. A lot of it has to do with this notion of Emily's relationship with the town. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is this idea. This idea of anachronistic or anachronism, okay? So I'm going to give you a couple examples of this. One example would be, I don't know if you've ever been to one of these Renaissance fairs or medieval fairs where people are dressed up in these kind of old fashioned clothes, and they're out there jousting and chewing on turkey legs, and wenches are serving beer, that kind of thing. Well, the people that usually put on these kind of activities typically belong to what are called anachronistic societies. And so what that means is they focus on a time in the past, and they actually bring that to life when they have these festivals and stuff. So they're people in the modern times kind of trying to live in the past or some other time. Another example would be the British royalty. So British royalty can't really do anything. They don't really have any power. The Queen of England can't say off with his head, or you know, we're going to invade France. Can't do any of those kind of things. However, they're very prominent. I mean, geez, every time one of them gets married or something, you know, it's a 3-day event on TV. Anyway, so, but the British people still keep them around, and they're important to the British people. The British people kind of finance the royalty. Their tax dollars go to support this royalty thing. Well, think about it in terms of a symbol. The royalty is a symbol of the greatness, or the once greatness, of Britain. And at one time, Britain was a big deal. It was probably the most powerful nation on earth. When you think about colonialism and all that kind of thing. So Britain was sort of the big dog. Yet it's not anymore, but it's a symbol to the people of the once greatness, which is apparently important to them, of Britain. And I think Emily's the same way. Emily, who is this anachronistic character who's kind of living in this beat up old plantation mansion kind of house, represents to them the time prior to the Civil War. It's their last hold on this kind of idealized, romanticized, glorious notion of the past. I don't think that they could articulate that, or I think it's pretty subconscious with them. But so like the royal family is to Britain, well, I think Emily is to the people in this town. Okay, so here's some key questions, and we won't answer them all here, but they'll all be answered as we kind of go through this. And I've set this up kind of like I did with the Story of an Hour materials. We're going to kind of go through it and talk about it in terms of these kind of 9 elements of fiction that we'll be dealing with. So I think I kind of answered the first question here: how is Emily anachronistic? So I think we've got that. What does she mean to the people of the town? Maybe at a subconscious level. Well, I think we've talked about that also. She represents this sort of better past in the South. One of the things I want to go back and touch on that I forgot about is, you know, part of this decadence and decay that Faulkner focuses on, really sometimes some of the stories really just, that's what they deal with exactly, but it's always kind of on the fringes is, you know, prior to the Civil War, you could be the worst, poorest, most downtrodden white person in the South, but you could always still kind of take comfort in one thing: you were still better off than a slave. Okay, well, once the Civil War ends, now you've got the kind of the poorer folk of the South competing now with these freed slaves for resources. And boy, if you don't think that brought about some hostility and some anger, you got another thing to think about. A lot of the Klan stuff, a lot of the lynching stuff, the Jim Crow stuff really just comes out of this, that the power structures have been turned upside down, and you know, people who were once, you know, even though they were at the bottom, they were still kind of in, aren't anymore. Okay. What does Emily really want? Well, I think it's easy. She wants love. She wants to be loved. She's just like the rest of us. That's what she wants. And we find out in the exposition is one of the things we find out is her dad. Boy, every time a boy comes sniffing around, her dad would run that guy off. So why is the family against a relationship with Homer? Well, the Grierson name was once a fine, fine Southern name. And still, even in the early part of the 20th century, the idea of a Southerner marrying a Northerner, not, especially if you were sort of in the, I don't know if I want to, this, well, I guess I'll just say sort of this kind of once aristocratic kind of family is a big taboo. They weren't going to have Emily sully the fine Grierson name by marrying no Northerner, I'll tell you that. All right, is there really a chance of a relationship with Homer? Well, let me go back to number 4 real quick. So a lot of that has to do with tradition that idea of hereditary obligation, um, those kind of ideas that I actually had you deal with in the discussion board. So is there really a chance of a relationship with Homer? The answer is no. Homer's not interested in marrying Emily. Homer's just sort of doing a friends with benefits thing while he's there working on the roads with a traveling road construction crew. It's better to stay there than pay rent at a motel. The other big question, and you guys probably have the same question or the same idea, is in one part of the story, it talks about Homer prefers the company of young men. All right. Well, a lot of people go, oh, well, he must be gay. Well, maybe he is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. I don't think it's relevant in this story, though, because whether he's gay or not, he's not staying with Emily. And another way to possibly look at this is that really Homer is really just a bachelor, and really he'd rather spend most of his time down at the bar with his co-workers and stuff, playing pool and drinking beer, than being there with Emily, except for to go there and sleep and eat. So that's another way to look at it. Where's the rose? Because the title implies she gets one. It says a rose for Emily. So once you hear it, it's kind of obvious. So we're really going to talk about this in terms of symbolism, okay? One of the most conventional symbols of love is a rose, typically a red rose, I guess. You know, it's just like hearts, okay? So it's not one you really have to make a big stretch for. So a rose is symbolic of love. Well, a rose for Emily could be translated to love for Emily, okay? Well, does she get love? Well, it's true. She does. Now, does she do it in a real twisted, creepy, kind of insane way? Well, absolutely. But the fact of the matter is she does definitely, find love. Another thing to think about is when it comes time for prom and all that kind of stuff, some poor guy goes out and buys a corsage for a girl, and or people give flowers or a rose, things like that. And there's this sort of tradition that, you're supposed to sort of preserve those things. Some people put them in books, in freezers, they press them, they hang them to dry, they do all kinds of things. Essentially, they kind of dry out the flower to preserve it, for, I don't know why, but they do. Well, if you think about the way that the condition that Homer was found in, is very reminiscent of what one would do with like a rose to preserve it. They talk about it as being kind of dried out, like a flower. And of course, the weird part is that, so she preserves him, just like a person would preserve a flower. Of course, then they find one of her gray hairs on the pillow and they kind of really get freaked out. So now here's another question. It's not really key, but I find it really interesting, is why did Toby disappear right after Emily's death? Well, I would have done the same thing Toby did. About the time those folks showed up, man, I would have hightailed it out of there. They didn't, and it says in the book that, he left and was never heard from or seen again. Well, if I was Toby, here's what I'd be thinking. You got to remember the time. Reconstruction, post-Civil War, incredibly racist South. I bet he was thinking, boy, I tell you, somehow those crackers are going to find a way to blame me for this. And he got the hell out. Okay. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. All right. So, excuse me. Protagonist, clearly Emily. She really hasn't changed. She hasn't changed, but she does change because she finally gets the one thing she wants, love. Strange way to get love and to be loved, but she does get it. So she does actually change. Antagonist. In a story like this, there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of different ways to look at things. And as I've been kind of clear about before, is I don't much care whether I agree with you or not. I just want you to make a good case or offer up good reasons in support of whatever it is you think. So one could really focus on the antagonist being these ideas of tradition or heritage, okay? Emily presents the lost and glorious past and the traditions of that past. So You know, maybe this notion that the townspeople really want to cling on to some kind of connection to the past, and they kind of keep her kind of in this static kind of way of life, where she doesn't really have to do anything. Um, uh, that could be an antagonist. So again, these are really connected and related. So the townspeople, they kind of look the other way and make all kinds of concession regarding Emily's behavior. They when they don't make her pay her taxes, which if they'd have made her pay her taxes, she'd have probably had to get a job and actually have a life. But since she didn't have to pay that, she could kind of maintain whatever, you know, the house that she was living in, and, you know, have some food. They smell something really bad coming from her house. So rather than investigate it, they just kind of, I like to say, buy a bunch of Febreze and spray it down. But in the story, they use, I think, lime to make the smell go away. But they never really go in to find out where the smell's coming from. And the pharmacist, pharmacist, he sells her poison in the narrative. Says, well, you know, usually they don't sell poison to people, but since it was Emily, they kind of look the other way. Okay. Another way to kind of look at antagonists, and again, there's probably a combination of these things, is just this idea of the past. And this is probably kind of a combination of the two things above. It appears at a first look, it's you know, that it's kind of murky, but, you know, there's similar ideas that run through all of these, and I think that, you know, you could take one of them and focus on them, or you could kind of combine them. But these are all things that kind of contribute to you know, Emily's situation, and the drastic measures she took to get love. Okay, so conflict. I think in a broad sense, it's between Emily and the townspeople. A more specific would be Emily and ideas of tradition, heritage, and or duty. Another view could be how these items interfere with Emily finally acquiring what it is she really wants, love. And that conflict could be the anachronistic nature of Emily's existence. So, you know, like I've been clear, there's not just one answer to these things. There can be different answers or combinations, or you can just take one and play it out. Setting, Deep South, late Reconstruction era, 1920s. How do we know this? Well, when Faulkner describes the town, it says her kind of house is in this, which was once a really nice part of the town, or kind of on the edge of town, is now in this kind of industrial kind of place where there's a lot of shops and buildings like that. It's truly a Southern story because the dynamics or tensions that are present in the post-Civil War, in the South post-Civil War, are still to some degree present. Okay. Symbolism. Emily's okay. So this question would be: can a character be a symbol? Well, I think Emily definitely fits the bill here. She's a symbol of an idealized and romanticized idea of the South pre-Civil War, a fallen monument to the past. Okay, her house. It's located, and we kind of talked about this just a second ago, located in once a fine area of town, now surrounded by modern industrial type businesses. He describes her house in language that suggests decay, falling apart, disrepair. One, especially Faulkner, would also use that language to describe the post-Civil War South in general. So it's kind of, her house just kind of represents the South in a very general way. Toby, kind of like a slave. I already talked about this, so I'm getting out of here for those crackers try to blame me for this mess. And finally, the rose, okay? So we talked about that, and we talked about this idea of preservation. And of course, we talk about Homer, and he's all dried out like a preserved flower, all right? Narration is second person, told from the perspective of one of the townspeople. It's kind of the collective voice of the citizens. All the narrator does is tell us about things that happened to Emily that he knew about. We never know what Emily really thinks, but the author, through this narrator, gives us enough information to connect those dots, which that's what makes a good writer. Through the narrative, we know what we need to know. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop here for a second. Then I'll start again.